There is a precise moment, right before a free soloist leaves the earth, when they cease to be a person with an escape plan. No rope, no harness, no metal rack of gear clinking rhythmically against their hip, just bare skin. A small bag of white magnesium carbonate chalk, and 800 to 1,000 feet of sheer, vertical granite soaring into the sky. In this space, there is only one absolute unyielding rule. Do not be wrong. Not once. Not for a single move. Not for the next 3 or 4 hours it will take your hands and feet to find purchase on microscopic ridges of stone. On the morning of Friday, May 28, 1993, the heavy, moisture-laden air of a late spring storm hung low over Yosemite Valley. High above the valley floor, the massive dark obelisk of Sentinel Rock loomed like a giant tombstone. 2 climbers were hiking along the rough talus slopes near the base of the wall, their gear rattling in their packs. As they stepped onto the low-angle second-class ledges at the start of the Chulnar-Herbert route, directly at the bottom of the fall line of the infamous Steck-Salathé, something caught their eye. It wasn't a discarded piece of webbing, it wasn't a dropped water bottle, it was a body, a man wearing simple climbing clothes, lying motionless on the cold stone. There was no rope attached to him, no harness wrapped around his waist. In Yosemite Valley during the spring of 1993, there were perhaps 200 climbers living out of the dirt in Camp 4, but they did not need to check the man's driver's license to know exactly who lay on those wet rocks. There was only one climber in the entire world who regularly, almost casually, free-soloed routes of this immense scale and physical brutality, routes that most elite climbers struggled to complete even when tied into a web of nylon ropes and anchored by steel cams. It was Derek Hersey. To his friends, he was known simply as Dr. Death. The nickname was not born out of recklessness. Derek was not a daredevil or a stuntman chasing adrenaline for a television camera. He was a master craftsman of movement, a philosopher of the vertical, and perhaps the most pure free soloist of his generation. The nickname Dr. Death was a piece of classic Camp 4 gallows humour, a nod to his uncanny, almost supernatural calmness when face to face with the ultimate consequence. He was a man who had looked into the abyss so many times that the abyss had simply become a familiar neighbour. But on that damp May morning, the neighbour finally stepped across the threshold. How did one of the most beloved, respected and physically gifted rock climbers of the 20th century end up on those cold ledges? What happened on the dark, polished granite of the Steck-Salathé when the clouds rolled in and the friction disappeared? To understand the death of Derek Hersey, we have to travel back to the rain-slicked quarries of northern England, into the dirtbag counterculture of Yosemite's golden age, and deep into the psychology of a man who chose to live his life entirely without a safety net, the making of a dusty legend. To understand the climber Derek Hersey became, you have to understand where he came from. He was born on October 26, 1956, in the industrial heartland of Manchester, England. This was not the sunny, dry, perfect granite of California. This was a world of grey skies, persistent drizzle, and limestone quarries that felt as cold and unforgiving as the coal mines that once fueled the region. Derek's father, a quiet and hard-working man, had hoped his son would find a stable trade in Manchester's post-industrial economy. But from his earliest years, Derek was drawn to the outdoors, specifically to the crags of Derbyshire and Yorkshire. He began climbing as a teenager, cutting his teeth on the steep polished limestone of Stony Middleton. Stony Middleton in the 1970s was a brutal school of hard knocks. British traditional or trad climbing was the law of the land. The gear of the era was primitive, clunky metal nuts wedged into cracks, slung over rocks, and early nylon ropes that offered a harsh, rib-cracking catch if you fell. But more than the gear, the culture itself was severe. In the British climbing scene, fear was not something you discussed over a pint of bitter at the local pub. It was something you swallowed. If you screamed on a lead, if you hesitated, or if you placed too much gear, you were labelled a punter, a novice, an amateur, someone who lacked the mental fortitude for the high-stakes game of British rock. It was in this severe, competitive environment that Derek developed his signature style. He discovered early on that he possessed an extraordinary, almost biological capacity to manage his nervous system. Where other climbers felt their hearts hammer against their ribs as they moved above poor protection, Derek felt a strange, quiet clarity. He began soloing small gritstone and limestone routes because, to him, the rope was often just an administrative hassle. It got in the way of the flow of movement. He loved the feeling of being completely unencumbered, of feeling the rock directly through his fingers and toes, without the heavy weight of nylon dragging him down. By the early 1980s, the economic stagnation of Thatcher-era Britain offered little future for a young man who wanted nothing more than to touch stone. Like many of his compatriots, Derek looked west toward the promise of America, where the weather was warm and the walls were infinite. He packed a single duffel bag with a pair of climbing shoes, a chalk bag, and a few ragged clothes, and bought a one-way ticket to the United States. When he arrived in Boulder, Colorado, he found his spiritual home. Boulder in the 1980s was the crucible of American Front Range climbing. El Dorado Canyon, with its towering red and golden sandstone walls, offered thousands of feet of highly technical, steep, and microscopic climbing. It was a place where friction was a religion, and exposure was absolute. Derek quickly integrated himself into the local climbing scene, but he did so on his own terms, which meant living as far below the poverty line as humanly possible to maximize his time on the rock. He didn't have a car, he didn't have a career. For years, he rented a tiny 10 by 10 foot basement room in Boulder, with no windows. It was barely large enough to fit a sleeping bag and a pile of dusty climbing magazines. To pay the $50 a month in rent and buy enough food to survive, he worked odd jobs. He was a dishwasher, a house painter, and for a long stretch, a kitchen hand making pizzas and prepping ingredients at Murray's Delicatessen on the Boulder Hill. His co-workers at Murray's, including a young traveller named Gil McCulloch, had no idea that the dishevelled, eccentric Englishman, who spent his shifts singing off-key, telling long stories in his thick Mancunian accent, and cracking self-deprecating jokes, was actually one of the most elite athletes on the planet. To them, he was just Dirty Derek, a nickname he earned because he famously went weeks, sometimes months, without a shower. He lived in the dirt, slept in the woods, and wore clothes that looked like they had been dragged through a chimney because, quite literally, they had. He would show up to work with his fingernails permanently stained with dirt and his skin smelling of pine needles and sweat, completely unbothered by what polite society thought of him. John Middendorf, a legendary big wall climber and close friend of Derek's, recalled climbing the nose on El Capitan with him. They called themselves Team Stink. Middendorf had just spent 7 days on the highly technical Iron Hawk route without a shower, and Derek hadn't bathed in a month. They climbed the 3,000-foot face of El Capitan with a laughably small rack of gear, forgetting to bring extra carabiners, laughing their way up the wall while smelling so rancid that other roped parties could scent them from several pitches away. To Derek, these hardships were not sacrifices. They were the very fabric of his freedom. He did not climb for sponsors, he did not climb for fame, and he certainly did not climb for money. He climbed because he had to. It was his oxygen, his meditation, his entire reason for being. But as the 1980s transitioned into the 1990s, Derek's climbing began to take on an almost mythic quality. He was no longer just soloing easy warm-ups. He was taking on the most technical, sustained routes in El Dorado Canyon and Yosemite Valley, without a rope and without a single doubt in his mind. The golden age and the mathematics of risk. As the 1980s drew to a close, rock climbing was undergoing a massive cultural evolution. The golden age of Yosemite free soloing was in full swing. John Bashar, with his chiseled physique, strict fitness regimen, and uncompromising ethics, had become a global icon of the sport. Alongside him, the brilliant Canadian climber Peter Croft was redefining what was possible, soloing massive links of multiple multi-thousand-foot routes in a single day. The climbing media fell in love with these figures. They were presented as vertical gods, flawless, calculating, and invincible. But Derek Hersey was different. He didn't fit the mould of the clean-cut athletic hero. He was a dirtbag philosopher who spoke in a thick Manchester accent, stroked a thin, scraggly tuft of beard on his chin, and drank cheap beer around the Camp 4 campfires. Yet, when he touched the rock, his movement was indistinguishable from magic. To understand the sheer scale of what Derek was doing, one must look at the routes he chose. In El Dorado Canyon, he free-soloed the Bulge, 5.12a, a route featuring extremely thin, delicate fingerholds on a wildly overhanging face. To fall from the crux of the Bulge meant a screaming 100-foot plunge into a boulder-strewn creek bed. He soloed Rosy Crucifixion, 5.10a, a classic, highly exposed crack line. In Yosemite, he would regularly climb 1,500-foot routes in a fraction of the time it took roped parties, moving with a steady, rhythmic pace that looked as natural as walking down a city sidewalk. Outsiders looking at free soloing often assume it is a form of suicide on the installment plan, a reckless, adrenaline-fueled gamble. But to Derek, and to those who understood the discipline, it was the exact opposite. It was a practice of absolute control. Free soloing isn't about taking chances, a contemporary of Derek's once noted. It's about eliminating them. Before Derek would ever attempt to solo a route, He would climb it dozens of times with a rope. He would study every single placement, every ripple in the granite, every crystal's grain. He would clean the dirt out of the cracks, memorize the sequence of his hands and feet, and practice the moves until they were wired. This is the process of building motor memory so deep that it bypasses the conscious, hesitating brain. When a soloist is high on a wall, they are not deciding where to put their left foot. Their left foot simply goes where it has gone 50 times before. But there is a dark mathematical trap hidden within this philosophy. No matter how many times you practice a route, no matter how wired your muscle memory is, you cannot control the physical universe. The rock is not a static gym hold. It is a living, changing geological entity. A tiny pebble can break under a foot. A bird can fly out of a horizontal crack, startling you. A sudden gust of wind can throw off your balance on a delicate slab. And, most dangerous of all, the micro-conditions of the rock can shift in an instant. Yosemite's high granite walls are notorious for generating their own microclimates. A warm, sunny morning can quickly give way to cold, damp winds as air is sucked up from the valley floor. Granite is a highly crystalline rock. When it is warm and dry, the friction between rubber climbing shoes and the stone is incredibly high. But if the temperature drops, or if the humidity rises, the moisture in the air condenses on the cold granite, forming a microscopic film of water. To a roped climber, this is an annoyance. Their feet might slip, they take a short dynamic fall on their nylon rope, curse, and pull back onto the rock. To a free soloist, that microscopic film of water is a death sentence. Derek understood this math. He wasn't stupid. He knew that every time he left the ground without a rope, he was entering a contract with the mountain. The mountain promised to remain vertical and solid. Derek promised to be perfect. But the mountain had never actually signed the contract. In Zion National Park, during a spring climbing season, Derek's friend Brad Quinn asked him about their shared mantra of climbs before girls. Derek paused, stroked his beard, and delivered a line that became legend among his friends. Well, I'll say this. Climbing can kill you, but women can destroy you. There's a big difference, you know. It was a classic Derek joke. Dry, humorous, and deeply telling. He knew the risks of his lifestyle. He chose them anyway. Because to Derek, a life lived in fear of the ultimate consequence was not a life worth living at all. He had found a peace on the high walls that he could never quite replicate on the flat ground of normal society. The obelisk of Sentinel Rock. By late May of 1993, Derek was 36 years old. He had been soloing at the highest level for over a decade. He was in peak physical condition, his fingers calloused like leather, his mind as calm as a mountain lake. He had travelled to Yosemite Valley for the spring season. Yosemite was crowded with the usual cast of characters, but the weather that May was highly unstable. A series of late-season Pacific storms were rolling over the Sierra Nevada, bringing heavy clouds, sudden drops in temperature, and intermittent rain. It was the kind of weather that kept most sensible climbers close to the ground, drinking coffee in their tents or climbing short, easily escapable routes near the valley floor. But Derek was restless. He didn't like sitting in Camp 4, listening to the rain patter against the nylon tents. He wanted to feel the rock. On the morning of May 28, 1993, he decided to hike up to Sentinel Rock. Sentinel is one of the most imposing monoliths in Yosemite. It rises nearly 1,600 feet straight out of the forest on the south side of the valley, a dark, gloomy, north-facing wall that rarely sees the sun. Because of its orientation, it remains cold, damp, and shadowy long after the rest of the valley has dried out. The route Derek chose was the legendary Steck-Salathé. First climbed in 1950 by Alan Steck and John Salathé, the route is a massive 15-pitch monster, rated 5.9 or 5.10 depending on which variation you take. But the rating tells only a fraction of the story. The Steck-Salathé is not a delicate face climb, it is a physical brawl. It consists of wide, cavernous chimneys where you must wedge your entire body into the crack, using your back, knees and elbows to scrape your way upward. It features off-width cracks, fissures too wide for hand jams but too narrow for body chimneying, which require grueling, exhausting physical exertion. The physical crux of the route is the Narrows, a spectacular highly exposed chimney high on the wall, where the climber must bridge their body over hundreds of feet of empty air. Even for modern climbers using advanced gear, the Steck-Salathé is a grueling 5 to 10 hour ordeal that leaves you bruised, battered and dehydrated. Derek had soloed the Steck-Salathé before. He knew it intimately. To him, it was a magnificent workout, a place where he could lose himself in the physical rhythm of the chimneys. He had once boasted that he could climb it in under 2 hours, a feat that felt borderline superhuman to those who had struggled up it over the course of a long, painful day. As he packed his small day pack that morning, he didn't bring much: a light windbreaker, a chalk bag, his climbing shoes, and perhaps a single can of Pepsi, his trademark climbing fuel. He didn't tell many people where he was going. He didn't need to. In Derek's mind, this was just another run up a familiar hill. But as he hiked up the steep, grueling approach trail toward the base of Sentinel Rock, the sky above him was already beginning to change. The clear morning air was being pushed out by a heavy grey ceiling of clouds rolling in from the west. The humidity was rising rapidly. To anyone watching from the valley floor, the dramatic irony was agonizing. The viewers of his life knew what Derek could not fully appreciate from the dense canopy of the pine forest. A localized, moisture-heavy weather system was settling directly over the high peaks of Sentinel. Derek reached the base of the wall, stepped out of his hiking boots and pulled on his tight, sticky rubber climbing shoes. He dipped his hands into his chalk bag, coating his fingers in a fine white powder. He looked up at the towering dark chimney system of the Steck-Salathé. There was no one there to cheer him on, no cameras, no safety team, just the quiet rustle of the wind through the pines and the cold, silent face of the granite. He placed his hands on the rock. He lifted his feet off the dirt, and with that single movement the contract was active. He was no longer a resident of the earth. He was a creature of the wall. The silent slip. As Derek moved up the lower pitches of the Steck-Salathé, he would have felt the familiar, comforting flow of movement. His body knew exactly what to do. Reach, jam, smear, push. The first few hundred feet of the climb went smoothly. He was moving fast, far faster than any rope team could ever dream of. But as he climbed higher, the environment around him began to deteriorate. The clouds closed in, wrapping the upper half of Sentinel Rock in a cold grey mist. The temperature began to plummet. In Yosemite, when a cloud bank sits on a high granite face, the rock acts like a giant condenser. The moisture in the fog clings to the stone, turning the dry, grippy surface into a slick, greasy pane of glass. Derek would have noticed the chalk on his fingers turning pasty and wet. When chalk gets wet, it loses its ability to absorb sweat and instead becomes a slippery lubricant. He would have had to blow on his hands constantly, trying to keep them dry, reaching into his chalk bag only to find the powder inside clumping together from the heavy humidity. Worse, his climbing shoes, the sticky rubber that was his only connection to the vertical wall, would have started to lose their grip. On granite, climbing shoes rely on molecular friction. When the rock gets cold and damp, the rubber hardens, and the thin layer of water acts as a barrier, preventing the rubber from biting into the rock's crystals. By the time Derek reached the middle section of the wall, around pitch 8 or 9, he was in a terrifying position. He was too high to downclimb. Downclimbing technical granite without a rope is infinitely harder than climbing up. You cannot see your footholds, and your weight is shifted away from the wall, making slips far more likely. He could not yell for help. There was no one on the trail below, and the wind wrapping around the buttress of Sentinel would have swallowed his voice. He had only one option: keep moving upward. He had to reach the top. We will never know the exact sequence of events that occurred next. There were no witnesses, but investigators from the National Park Service, analysing the fall line and the locations of his gear, were able to reconstruct a highly likely scenario. High on the Steck-Salathé near the infamous Wilson Overhang, or the entry to the Narrows, the climbing becomes highly strenuous and exposed. Here, the rock is vertical, and the holds are small and polished by decades of climbers' boots. Derek would have been fighting against time, his forearms burning with lactic acid, his fingers numb from the biting cold of the damp Sierra air. He would have reached for a hold, perhaps a familiar edge he had held 20 times before. He would have shifted his weight onto his feet, preparing to make the next move. And then his foot slipped. It wouldn't have been a dramatic struggle. In free soloing, a slip is instantaneous. 1 millisecond, you are solid, connected to the universe. The next, gravity has taken hold, and you are in free fall. He fell nearly 1,000 feet through the cold, grey mist. He did not scream. Climbers who have survived long falls often report a strange, peaceful silence as the wind rushes past. The struggle is over. The calculations have ceased. The mountain had finally enforced its ultimate rule. Act 5, the shockwave through Camp 4. On the morning of Saturday, May 29th, 1993, the rain from the night before had finally cleared, leaving Yosemite Valley sparkling in the clean, bright sunlight. 2 climbers were making their way up the talus slope beneath Sentinel Rock, planning to climb one of the classic routes on the lower buttress. As they scrambled over the boulders, they saw a shape lying on the flat, sandy ledge at the base of the wall. They approached cautiously, their hearts sinking as they realized what they were looking at. The impact of a 1,000-foot fall on solid granite is catastrophic. The human body is not designed to withstand such forces. The climbers did not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It was clear that death had been instantaneous, occurring probably the afternoon or evening before when the storm was at its peak. They scrambled back down to the road and called the National Park Service search and rescue team. Within hours, the news had penetrated the fragile, tight-knit community of Camp 4. In a campground where gossip usually travelled at light speed, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the tents. People sat on picnic tables, staring blankly at the massive granite walls towering above them. "Not Derek," someone said. "Not Dr. Death." To the climbers of Camp 4, Derek Hersey had seemed invincible. He was the benchmark. If Derek could fall, if the master of movement, the man who had soloed the Steck-Salathé and El Capitan could slip and die, then what did that mean for the rest of them? It was a collective realization that the game they were playing was not a game of skill after all. It was a game of Russian roulette, and the cylinder had finally spun to the live round. A search and rescue helicopter arrived, its rotors thumping loudly against the canyon walls as it hovered near the base of Sentinel Rock. Rangers recovered Derek's body, wrapping him in a grey body bag and flying him out of the valley. The climbing world was devastated. Tributes poured in from around the globe, but unlike other climbing accidents, which were often followed by endless debates about gear failure, safety procedures, or poor judgment, there was no such debate for Derek. He had climbed alone, unroped, by choice. He had played the game by its purest rules, and he had lost. His close friend John Middendorf wrote a moving letter shortly after Derek's death, remembering the laughter, the dirt, the shared beer, and the profound wisdom of a man who lived without compromise. "We'll miss you, Derek," Middendorf wrote. "You were the chief punter of the planet, and the world is a far greyer place without you." The legacy of the unroped. More than 3 decades have passed since Derek Hersey fell from Sentinel Rock. The climbing world has changed beyond recognition. The dirtbag culture of Camp 4 has been largely replaced by professional athletes with corporate sponsors, social media managers, and cutting-edge training regimens. Free soloing, once a dirty secret whispered about in dusty campgrounds, has been thrust into the global mainstream by films like Free Solo, which documented Alex Honnold's historic unroped descent of El Capitan's freerider route in 2017. But to those who know the history of the sport, Derek Hersey's ghost still hovers over the granite walls of Yosemite. His death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a haunting, repeating pattern that has claimed many of the greatest free soloists to ever live. In July of 2009, John Bashar, the man who had defined the golden age of soloing, the icon of mental control, fell to his death while soloing on Dyke Wall near Mammoth Lakes, California. He was 51 years old. Like Derek, Bashar was climbing on a route far below his technical limit, a route he had climbed hundreds of times before, but a split-second slip, a moment of bad friction, and the icon was gone. Peter Croft, the third member of that legendary triumvirate, survived. He is still alive today, climbing with a rope, retired from the extreme edge of free soloing. When you look at the history of free soloing, the statistics are terrifying. John Bashar, Derek Hersey, Brad Gobright, Uli Emanuele, Dean Potter, Marc-André Leclerc, all of them masters of their craft, all of them highly disciplined, all of them dead because of the sport they loved. Why do they do it? Why do they step across that line where a single mistake means death? Perhaps the answer lies in the very thing that makes free soloing so terrifying: the absolute simplicity of the stakes. In modern life, we are surrounded by grey areas, compromises and safety nets that dull our senses. We worry about our careers, our finances, our reputations, our futures. But when you are 800 feet up a vertical wall with no rope, the future does not exist. The past does not exist. There is only this hold, this foot placement, this breath. It is a state of absolute hyper-focused presence, a high so pure and addictive that for some, the flat ground of normal life begins to feel like a prison. Derek Hersey chose that presence over everything else. He chose to live a life that was raw, dirty, honest, and entirely his own. He lived in a windowless basement, wore rags, and washed dishes. But when he was on the Steck-Salathé, he was a king. The dark, cold granite of Sentinel Rock still stands today, casting its long shadow across Yosemite Valley. The Steck-Salathé is still climbed by parties using ropes and cams, their metal gear clinking in the dark chimneys. And sometimes, if the wind is blowing just right through the pines at the base of the wall, you can almost hear the faint, echoing sound of a British accent, cracked with laughter, reminding us all of the deal we make whenever we choose to live our lives on the very edge of the abyss. The pilgrimage to Stony Middleton and beyond. But to fully grasp the weight of Derek's absence, one must understand how deep his roots ran in the northern soils of England. Long before he was Dr. Death, he was just Derek, the young lad from Manchester, who would hitchhike down the A6 to Stony Middleton. Stony Middleton is a limestone gorge located in the Peak District of Derbyshire. It's a place of deep climbing tradition, where the rock is characterised by steep, polished pockets and micro edges. The climbing there is notorious for its finger-wrecking technical nature. To climb well at Stony, you cannot rely on sheer physical strength. You must possess an intimate understanding of balance and microfriction. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Stony Middleton was the centre of a revolutionary movement in British climbing. A group of young, working-class climbers, facing high unemployment and bleak economic prospects under the Conservative government, dedicated their entire lives to the crags. They lived in nearby caves, abandoned barns, or the back of old vans, climbing almost every single day. They pushed the grades of technical climbing to new heights, often climbing with little to no protection. It was a subculture of absolute dedication and raw, unadulterated passion. Derek was at the very heart of this scene. His friends from that era remember him as a bundle of manic energy, always talking, always laughing, and always eager to get on the rock. He would climb in any weather, rain, sleet, or snow. If the rock was too wet to climb, he would spend hours traversing the low boulders at the base of the cliffs, building the finger strength and mental endurance that would later make him famous in America. When Derek made the decision to move to the United States, it was not because he wanted to escape his roots, but because he had outgrown the scale of the British crags. The cliffs of Derbyshire, while technically extremely demanding, are relatively short. Most routes are no more than 80 to 100 feet long. Yosemite and Colorado offered him the one thing England could not: infinite vertical space. But even as he became a legend in the American climbing scene, Derek never lost his characteristic British humility and humour. He remained, until his very last breath, the chief punter of the planet, a man who refused to take himself or his incredible achievements seriously. He was always quick to mentor younger climbers, sharing his knowledge of the rock with anyone who showed a genuine passion for the sport, completely regardless of their skill level. His death left a void in the climbing community that has never been truly filled. While modern free soloists like Alex Honnold have achieved global fame and commercial success, Derek Hersey represents a bygone era of pure, uncompromised climbing. An era where the only reward was the movement itself, and the only audience was the silent, indifferent stone. As the sun sets over Yosemite Valley, casting its warm golden light on the towering face of El Capitan, the shadows lengthen over Sentinel Rock. The Steck-Salathé remains, a physical testament to the vision of Alan Steck and John Salathé, and a haunting monument to the life and death of Derek Hersey. It stands as a reminder that in the grand game of the vertical, the mountain always has the final word. But for those 3 hours on May 28, 1993, before the clouds rolled in and the friction slipped away, Derek Hersey was completely, beautifully, and absolutely free.